Blood shimmered like dark bronze beneath the dying sunset, soaking into the cracked earth of the savannah. The wind carried the smell of dust, heat, and something else. Something fading, something desperate. He almost missed it. The small shape lying motionless near the thorn bushes, its flank rising only when a weak breath managed to fight its way out. A lion cub, barely alive. Its ribs showed through its golden fur, each breath sharper than the last, as if the world was slowly slipping away from it. The man knelt beside the cub, expecting it to flinch, to bare tiny teeth, to cling to some instinct of survival. It didn't. Instead, with trembling effort, the cub lifted its head and looked at him. Not with fear, not with anger, with pleading. Then, using the last strength in its tiny, broken body, it dragged one paw forward. Then another. Its claws scraped the ground as it inched away, but not trying to escape. It kept looking back at him, urging him, commanding him in the only way it could. Follow me. He hesitated. The sun was almost gone. The savannah at night belonged to predators older and crueler than mercy. But something in those eyes, those fading, determined eyes, refused to let him walk away. The cub staggered, collapsed, pushed itself up again, and continued leading him toward the growing darkness. Whatever waited out there had forced a dying creature to move when even breathing hurt. And as he followed, one truth began to sink in. This was not about saving the cub. The cub was trying to save something else. The man had lived alone on the edge of the savannah for so long that silence felt more familiar than conversation. His small outpost sat perched on a ridge of red clay and sandstone, overlooking miles of dry grasslands that whispered endlessly beneath the wind. Every morning, he brewed his coffee over a dented metal stove, the smell of burnt grounds filling the single-room cabin as he watched the horizon shift from blue to gold. He rarely smiled. The lines around his eyes weren't carved from laughter, but from years of squinting into sun, dust, and memories he couldn't wash away. People knew him only as the Ranger, a man who patrolled long-forgotten borders and watched over wildlife no one else cared to protect. He wasn't old, but grief had aged him in ways time couldn't measure. A faded photograph sat tucked beneath his field journal, a woman and a child laughing beneath an acacia tree. He never looked at it, yet he never let it go. Some losses don't disappear. They just learn to live beside you. His days were predictable, checking broken fences, logging footprints in the dirt, tracking herds that grew smaller each year. Drought had drained the land, leaving cracked riverbeds and thirsty beasts competing for every drop of water. Sometimes at dusk, he spoke out loud, words meant for no one, drifting into the wind. Not today, he would mutter when the loneliness pressed in too hard. The land didn't answer, but its silence was better than the empty noise of memory. Yet recently, something had felt different. Strange sounds at night, faint cries carried by the wind. Small paw prints near the watering hole, too small for a grown lion, too erratic for a healthy cub. He noticed them, circled them with chalk, knelt long enough to sense the fear pressed into each indentation. Something was roaming these plains, something weak, lost, or hunted. He didn't know it yet, but the land had already chosen him for a purpose he never asked for. The cub wasn't the beginning. It was the consequence. The savannah itself felt like a character, vast, ancient, watching. When the wind swept across the tall, brittle grass, it carried not just dust, but stories older than any tribe or kingdom. Herds of wildebeest moved like living storms across the plains. Zebras carved black and white rivers through the golden fields, and high above, vultures traced circles that hinted at death long before it became visible. Everything here lived with a certain understanding: survive, or be swallowed by the sun. Farther south, near the dry river gorge, rumors had been spreading among the ranger stations. Hunters had been seen moving deeper into restricted territory. Gunshots echoed on nights when no storms rolled in. Tracks of pickup tires cut across dirt that should have been untouched. And there were other warnings too. Carcasses stripped too clean, prints of lion paws smaller than they should be, droplets of blood that disappeared into the cracked ground. The kind of signs that made veterans uneasy. But in the quiet moments, when dawn layered the world in soft gold, the ranger found small pockets of beauty that kept him anchored. A lone acacia tree standing defiant against the drought. A herd of elephants marching silently toward the last remaining waterhole. The distant rumble of thunder promising rain that never quite arrived. Even the emptiness had a strange serenity, like the land was holding its breath. He walked these plains not as a conqueror, but as someone trying to pay a debt he could never repay. Every snared animal he freed, every injured creature he carried back to safety, every trap he dismantled, it was all part of a quiet penance. He didn't believe in redemption, but he believed in trying. And lately, the savannah had been whispering to him differently. The nights felt heavier. The stars seemed sharper, as if watching him with expectation. Coyotes avoided certain areas. Birds flew off in frantic bursts at dusk. The land wasn't just suffering, it was signaling. He just didn't understand the message yet. Not until the dying cub touched his hand. The night it happened, the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the coppery scent of dust and heat. The ranger had just finished his last patrol and was heading back toward his outpost when a sound sliced through the stillness, sharp, thin, almost swallowed by the wind. At first he thought it was the metal hinge of an old fence, or maybe a distant jackal cry carried strangely by the air. But then it came again, a whimper, faint, wet, hurting. His boots froze mid-step. The savannah at night was a symphony of shifting shadows and hungry mouths, but this sound didn't belong in any of those categories. It was too fragile, too desperate, too young. He turned his flashlight toward the cluster of rocks near the base of the ridge. The beam shook slightly, not from fear, but from the instinctive tightening in his chest he always felt before confronting the unknown. Easy now, he muttered to himself, lowering his breathing as he approached. Then he saw it. A small shape curled beneath a thorn bush, chest rising in unsteady jerks. The cub's fur was matted with dirt and streaked with drying blood. One of its hind legs stuck out at an unnatural angle, and its breaths came in shallow, rattling bursts. Under the harsh white light, its eyes reflected not the wild defiance of a young predator, but exhaustion so deep it looked ancient. The ranger knelt slowly. His fingers hovered inches above the cub's trembling flank. He had found wounded animals before, but never one that clung so fiercely to life while being so close to losing it. The savannah had no mercy for the small or the slow. This cub should have been dead hours ago. Yet somehow, it wasn't. Somehow, it was waiting. The moment his hand brushed the ground beside it, the cub stirred. Its head lifted in a painfully slow arc, and for the briefest second, their eyes met. Something in that fleeting connection caught him in a place he thought had long since gone numb. The cub made a sound, so soft it barely existed, and pushed its nose against his wrist. Then it tried to stand, and the world shifted. The cub collapsed on its first attempt, its tiny body folding beneath its own weight. But it didn't give up. With a strangled breath, it clawed at the dirt, dragging itself forward inch by inch. The ranger reached out, instinctively trying to steady it, but the cub pulled away, not out of fear, but with a determined insistence that startled him. It wasn't fleeing, it was showing him something. "Hey, easy," he whispered, though the cub couldn't understand his words. But maybe it understood his voice, the quiet steadiness of it. The cub paused, panting hard, then turned its head back toward him. Its tail twitched weakly, like a signal. "Follow." A chill ran along the ranger's spine, even though the night was warm. Something felt deeply wrong, an imbalance hanging in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. He swept his flashlight across the darkness, searching for signs of what might have driven the cub here. Tracks? Blood? Another predator? Humans? Nothing. Just emptiness stretching in every direction. The cub forced itself up again, wobbling, then limped toward the open plains. Every few steps, it faltered, trembled, nearly fell, but each time it continued. The savannah swallowed the sound of its struggle, but the ranger heard every painful drag of its claws through dirt. He shouldn't follow. He knew better. Night travel was suicide. Predators owned these hours, and even he wasn't arrogant enough to challenge them. But the cub stopped again and turned its head. Its eyes, clouded, glassy, barely holding on, were filled with something that pierced straight through his defenses. Need. Not for rescue, not for itself, but for something or someone waiting out there. The ranger's throat tightened. Damn it. He grabbed his pack, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped into the darkness. Whatever had driven this dying cub to move when nothing else remained, he could feel it now, pulsing like a warning beneath the earth. And he knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain, this night would not let him return the same man. The cub didn't make it far before its legs buckled again. This time, when it crumpled into the dust, it didn't try to rise. Its tiny chest heaved with ragged, uneven breaths, each one sounding like a fragile promise about to break. The ranger dropped to one knee beside it, his heartbeat pounding louder than the wind. "Easy, easy, I've got you," he murmured. He slipped his hands beneath the cub, careful, steady, almost reverent. It weighed next to nothing, like lifting a bundle of bones wrapped in fading warmth. As he held it, something inside him shifted. A small creature trusting him with its last breaths. It echoed a memory he had fought to bury, a memory of holding someone else who had been slipping away. No, not now. He forced the thought back into the dark and focused on the cub. Its fur was crusted with dirt. Blood had dried along its hind leg, where deep cuts traced jagged patterns across the skin. The ranger exhaled sharply. This wasn't the work of a predator's bite. It was steel, sharp, man-made, a trap. His jaw tightened as he carried the cub back toward the ridge, moving fast but trying not to jostle it. The cub whimpered, a thin cry that sliced through him. "Hold on," he whispered. "Just hold on." At the outpost, he laid the cub onto an old blanket and reached for his emergency kit. His hands were steady, practiced, cleaning the wound, flushing the dirt, stitching the gash. The cub winced, but didn't fight him. If anything, it leaned closer, its small body trembling against his wrist. That simple, desperate touch nearly undid him. "Why are you fighting so hard?" he asked softly. It blinked slowly, eyes glazed with pain. And for the briefest moment, the ranger felt something unmistakable. The cub wasn't fighting for itself. It was fighting for time. When he finished stitching, he wrapped the leg with clean bandages and dripped a bit of water onto the cub's tongue. It swallowed weakly. Its breathing eased, but only slightly. He sat beside it for hours, listening to the soft rasp of its breaths. Every now and then, the cub would stir and press its head lightly against his hand, as if confirming he was still there. When dawn crept over the savannah and turned the sky into a wash of pale gold, the cub finally opened its eyes fully. There was clarity now, exhausted but sharp. Then, slowly, painfully, it tried to stand. The ranger reached instinctively to steady it, but the cub pulled away with surprising resolve. It limped toward the door, then looked back at him, urging, demanding. The journey wasn't over. He didn't want to let it continue. Not like this. Not with wounds barely closed and strength fading by the minute. But the cub's persistence was something primal, something older than pain or fear. Its instinct wasn't to survive. Its instinct was to lead. And whatever it needed to show him, it wouldn't die until it did. "All right," he whispered, rubbing tired hands over his face. "But I'm carrying you." He wrapped the cub gently in a canvas sling he'd once used for injured antelope and secured it to his chest. The cub didn't protest this time. Instead, it settled into the fabric and pressed its head against his heartbeat, drawing comfort from the steady rhythm. The ranger stepped out into the early morning haze, scanning the horizon. The cub shifted slightly, nose lifting toward the southeast, toward the deeper plains where predators roamed freely and human tracks grew more frequent. He frowned. "What's out there?" The cub didn't answer, but its trembling paw pushed against his chest, urging him forward. The path wasn't easy. The grass cracked underfoot, brittle with drought. The sun rose quickly, scorching the land before noon. Flies buzzed around them in relentless swarms, and the heat pressed against his skin like a heavy hand. Every mile they traveled, the cub grew weaker, its breaths shorter. Several times he stopped to rest in the shade of lone acacia trees, checking the cub's pulse, offering drops of water. Each time the cub tried to rise, as if time itself were slipping through its paws. Around midday, he noticed something troubling. Footprints. Human ones. Several pairs. Deep impressions in the dust. Some recent enough that the wind hadn't erased their shape. Poachers. His stomach clenched. That meant the cub's injuries weren't random. It wasn't lost. It was escaping something. And it had come to him. Why? The question gnawed at him as they trekked onward. His senses sharpened, every rustle in the grass making his hand twitch toward his knife. The savannah was dangerous enough on its own, but men with guns were worse. By late afternoon, storm clouds began to gather, thick and dark, rolling across the sky with a low rumble. The cub stirred uneasily, pushing against the sling. It wanted down. "You sure?" he asked. A weak paw tapped his arm. He lowered it gently to the ground. The cub stood on trembling legs, took a few slow steps, then looked back. Its gaze intense, urging, and continued limping toward a rocky pass ahead. The ranger followed, heart racing because he realized something. The cub wasn't leading him randomly. It knew exactly where it was going. The rocky pass narrowed into a winding path between sandstone cliffs stained with centuries of wind. The air cooled, the world dimmed, and the cub halted frequently, partly from exhaustion, partly as if checking for danger. The ranger stayed close behind, every sense alert. The silence here felt heavier, like the land was holding its breath. Halfway through the pass, the cub suddenly stopped and crouched low, trembling violently. The ranger knelt beside it, instinctively reaching to shield its tiny body. "What is it?" he whispered. Then he heard it. Metal, the faint jingle of chains, the whisper of shifting weight. Voices. Human voices. He pressed his back against the stone wall, pulling the cub close. Two men emerged around the bend, rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. Poachers. Their boots scraped the ground as they talked, laughing about something, careless, unaware of how their presence poisoned the air. The ranger held his breath. The cub pressed trembling paws against his chest, eyes wide with recognition. Fear, but also something else. Urgency. When the men finally moved out of sight, he exhaled shakily. That close. Too damn close. "That's what hurt you, isn't it?" he murmured. The cub looked at him with an expression almost human in its sorrow. He waited until the footsteps faded completely, then continued with greater caution. The cub led him deeper into the cliffs until the pass opened into a narrow gorge. There, the air smelled different, thick with the scent of blood and something raw, something grieving. The cub whimpered, a soft, heartbreaking sound. "What are you trying to show me?" he asked. The cub limped ahead, slow but determined, weaving between boulders until it reached a shaded overhang. There, half hidden beneath tangled brush, lay a sight that made the ranger's breath stop cold in his lungs. A lion's den, collapsed, destroyed. Claw marks and scuffs covered the ground, evidence of a desperate struggle, and at the far end, something stirred. The cub cried out, a sound filled with recognition and anguish. The ranger stepped forward, heart pounding, and saw them. A dying lioness, her sides heaving, her fur matted with blood and dust, and beside her, two newborn cubs, too weak to even cry. The truth hit him like a blow. The dying cub hadn't been running for its life. It had been running for theirs. Before he could react, the cub pressed against his leg and collapsed, its body shaking violently. Its time was running out, and their journey had only revealed the beginning of the tragedy. The ranger dropped to his knees beside the lioness, the weight of the moment crushing the air from his chest. She was enormous, her body once built for strength and thunderous roars, now reduced to a trembling silhouette beneath the overhang. Her breaths came shallow and staggered, each one rattling like a final stone sliding down a collapsing cliff. Her golden eyes flickered open, dim, unfocused, but they sharpened for a heartbeat when they landed on the cub who had led him here. Her cub. The injured youngster let out a soft cry and dragged itself closer, pressing its forehead against the lioness's neck. She responded with a faint rumble, a sound so fragile it barely existed. It wasn't a growl, it was recognition and mourning. The ranger swallowed hard, his throat burning. He wanted to help her. God, he wanted to. But even from a distance he could tell the truth. Multiple wounds along her flank, deep gashes, punctures from rifle butts or boots. She had fought to her last breath to protect the newborns behind her, and lost. The two tiny cubs nestled against her belly were little more than trembling shadows. Their eyes were still closed, their legs weak and rubbery. They nuzzled blindly, searching for milk that would never come. Their thin cries echoed in the enclosed den, small, fragile sounds that cut through him sharper than any blade. The ranger's hands shook as he reached toward one, then stopped. The lioness raised her head, barely, baring her teeth in a weak warning. Not malicious, not territorial. A mother's final instinct. He froze. "I won't hurt them," he whispered. Slowly, painfully, her jaw relaxed. She blinked at him once, twice, as if weighing his soul on some ancient scale only mothers and dying creatures possessed. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of gun oil. He stiffened. Footsteps, voices, too close. In his desperation to reach the den, he hadn't noticed the poachers circling back. The cub at his feet sensed them first. It rose unsteadily, hackles raised, a faint growl bubbling from its throat. But it was far too weak to protect anything. The ranger grabbed the small cub, ready to shield it, when a loud metallic clatter echoed through the gorge. A steel trap snapped shut behind him, baited, set deliberately. The lioness jerked, startled, her weakened body spasmed in pain. The newborns wailed, and then the shadows appeared. 3 men stepped into view, rifles slung casually as if they were returning from a successful hunt, which they were. Their eyes gleamed with recognition and something darker when they spotted the ranger. "Well, well," one of them sneered. "Looks like we've got company." The cub struggled in his arms, trying to defend what little family it had left. The ranger moved slowly, lowering it to the ground, but covering it protectively. "You don't want to do this," he warned. The men laughed. The sound echoed against the stone like something rotten. One lifted his rifle slightly, aiming not at the ranger, but at the injured cub. "No!" the ranger shouted, lunging forward. A boot slammed into his ribs, knocking the air out of him. He hit the ground hard, dust exploding around his face. The cub cried out in terror, and in that chaos, in that heartbeat of confusion and pain, the poachers reached down and grabbed the dying cub with brutal force. It screamed. The sound tore through the ranger like a blade. Before he could rise, before he could breathe, before he could fight, the men dragged the cub away and slammed it into a metal cage. The door clanged shut like a verdict. And the cub, the one who had trusted him more than anything else left in its world, looked at him through the bars with eyes full not of fear, but of confusion, as if asking, "Why didn't you stop them?" He clawed his way toward the cage, mind drowning in panic, but a rifle butt struck his jaw and sent him sprawling back into the dust. Stars burst across his vision. The taste of iron filled his mouth. He forced himself up, clutching at the stone wall, only to be pinned down again by a heavy boot pressing into his spine. "You think you own this land?" one of the men growled. "Think you get to tell us where we can hunt?" He leaned down, breath sour with cruelty. "You're alone out here, Ranger. No one's coming." The ranger spat blood into the dirt. "Let the cub go." "Let it go?" The man laughed, a sickening sound. "This one's worth a fortune. Lion parts sell high, and a live cub, even higher." The metal cage shook violently as the injured cub hurled itself against the bars, trying to reach the ranger. Its cries were hoarse, desperate, and filled with betrayal. The ranger's chest tightened so hard, he thought something inside him would break. He tried again to stand. The boot on his back pressed harder. "You should have stayed out of our way," another poacher said, kicking his ribs for emphasis. "But now you get to watch." He didn't care about the blows, didn't care about the pain. The only thing he saw, the only thing that mattered, was the cub's trembling body pressed against the cage door, its eyes locked onto him, pleading for something he couldn't give. Not yet. He forced himself to breathe, searching the ground for anything, a rock, a branch, anything he could use, but the men were ready. They shoved him deeper into the dirt, laughing, taunting, enjoying his helplessness. Behind them, the lioness released a low, guttural sound, half growl, half dying breath. She tried to rise, but her legs collapsed beneath her. Her body hit the ground with a thud. The newborn cubs squeaked helplessly. "She's next," one of the poachers said casually, pointing his rifle toward her. The ranger thrashed in place. "Stop!" But the gun didn't move away. If anything, it steadied. And he realized something horrifying. If they killed her now, the newborns would die, and the dying cub in the cage would have led him here for nothing. A sudden rage erupted inside him, raw, primal, unstoppable. He twisted sharply, throwing off the weight on his back just long enough to grab the nearest man's ankle. The poacher stumbled, swore, and slammed the butt of his rifle into the ranger's shoulder. Pain exploded across his body. He fell back, chest heaving, vision blurred. A second rifle butt struck the side of his head. The world tilted. Sound warped. Darkness crept in. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the cub, pressed against the bars, its tiny paw reaching toward him through the metal. And the last thing he heard was the lioness releasing one final, shuddering breath as the poachers laughed. Darkness didn't take him gently. It swallowed him like a predator, teeth first. He felt himself sinking deeper and deeper until sounds faded into a distant, muffled echo. But then slowly, painfully, the world dragged him back. A throbbing ache pulsed through his skull. His ribs felt like cracked branches. Dust clung to his tongue. When he opened his eyes, the world was a blur of shifting shadows and fading daylight. He wasn't in the gorge anymore. The poachers had dragged him out and dumped him near the mouth of the pass, like trash. Every breath stung, but he forced himself up on trembling elbows. Pain rippled down his side, white-hot and blinding. He bit back a groan. Gradually, shapes drifted into focus. Tire tracks gouged deep into the dirt. A crushed cigarette still smoldered near a footprint. And far ahead, on the uneven trail, the poacher's vehicle lumbered toward the horizon, kicking up clouds of dust behind it. They were leaving, with the cub, with the lioness's body, with everything he had sworn to protect. "No," he rasped, voice raw. He tried to stand. His knees buckled. He slammed into the ground with a choked gasp. The world tilted. His vision flickered. He couldn't do this. Not like this. Not broken, half-conscious, bleeding into the dirt. But then he heard something. Soft. Weak. Barely there. A cry. He forced his head up, scanning the rocks. The sound came again. A faint, helpless squeak. The newborn cubs. They were still in the collapsed den. He dragged himself back into the gorge, gripping vines, rocks, anything that would hold his weight. Every pull felt like it ripped muscle from bone. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not while something still needed saving. When he reached the overhang, the den was nearly silent, but two tiny bodies shifted in the dim light. Blind, trembling, alone. Orphans. He sank beside them, chest heaving. "I'm here," he whispered, though he wasn't sure they could hear or understand anything at all. He reached out, hands unsteady, lifting them gently. Their fur was warm but fragile. like holding life that wasn't yet sure if it wanted to stay. "I've got you," he murmured. A promise. And this time, he intended to keep it. He wrapped them inside his shirt, pressing them close to his heartbeat to warm them. Their small bodies wriggled weakly. One let out a tiny sound, like the beginning of hope. But then thunder rolled across the sky. A storm was building, fast and violent. Wind clawed at the cliffs. Dust spiraled. The air thickened with electricity. He looked toward the trail where the poachers had fled. They were getting farther away. He was losing them. Losing the cub that had trusted him more fiercely than any creature ever had. His pulse hammered. Sweat stung his eyes. His body begged him to stop, to rest, to accept the loss. But he couldn't, because the cub hadn't given up on him, not for one moment, not even when its last strength was slipping away. He stood, swaying dangerously. His legs felt like hollow twigs, but he forced himself forward, gripping the canyon walls for balance. He reached the opening of the gorge. The wind slammed into him, nearly knocking him down. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the plains. The poacher's truck was a distant speck now. But then, it stopped. A silhouette moved near the back of the truck. A man jumped down. Another shape struggled in his grip. Small, golden, trembling. The cub. They had taken it out of the cage. For what? To kill it? To silence it? "No," he whispered. Then louder, "No!" He stumbled forward, adrenaline surging through pain, through fear, through the last remnants of strength he had left. The storm broke open above him, rain slashing down in violent sheets. In the flash of lightning, he saw the poacher raise something, not a knife, not a rope, a gun. The cub was too weak to move. Its limbs dangled, its eyes, those brave, pleading eyes, were half closed. The ranger ran. He didn't remember how his legs moved. Didn't remember how he stayed upright. Didn't feel the rocks cutting into his feet. Didn't feel the blood dripping down his face. He only saw one thing, the cub about to be executed in the rain. A gunshot cracked across the plains. The ranger's heart stopped, but the cub, it jerked suddenly, twisting its small body, sinking its teeth into the poacher's wrist, with the last violent spark of life burning inside it. The shot went wild. The cub fell. The poacher screamed. The ranger reached them in a blind, furious sprint and threw himself into the fight. The collision knocked the poacher off his feet. The ranger slammed into him with every ounce of rage left in his body. They hit the muddy ground hard, rolling through the rain, fists and boots flying. Pain flared in the ranger's ribs, sharp, breath-stealing. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Another poacher ran toward them, shouting. Lightning cracked above them, turning the world white. The ranger grabbed a handful of mud and flung it into the man's eyes. The poacher stumbled, cursing, blinded long enough for the ranger to shove the first man aside and scrambled toward the cub lying motionless in the dirt. "Hey! Hey! Look at me!" he gasped, lifting the tiny body gently. The cub's breathing was faint, barely stirring the air. Rain washed over its fur in cold streams. Its eyes fluttered open for a moment, dim, searching. "I've got you," the ranger whispered, voice breaking. "I won't lose you. Not again." But there was no time. The second poacher recovered and raised his gun. The ranger turned, shielding the cub with his body. A shot fired. He braced. But something blurred through the storm, slamming into the poacher with the force of a falling boulder. A roar ripped through the air. The ranger froze. Out of the storm, through smoke, rain, and lightning, a massive silhouette leapt between him and the gun. A lion. Not the dying lioness from the den. Not any lion he recognized. A powerful male, scarred, wild, eyes burning like molten amber. He lunged at the poacher, jaws closing on the man's rifle arm. The poacher shrieked, scrambling away, stumbling into the mud. Another roar echoed. This one deeper, older. The lion stood between the ranger and the men like a guardian carved from the storm itself. The poachers panicked, scrambling back toward the truck. "Go, go, move!" one screamed. They tumbled into the vehicle, tires spinning wildly as the truck lurched forward, spraying mud. The lion charged at it, teeth bared, claws ripping at the metal as the poachers sped away into the darkness. Black smoke, red taillights. Then nothing. Silence settled, broken only by thunder and the ragged breathing of the lion. The massive beast turned slowly toward the ranger. The ranger shifted protectively, shielding the injured cub with his arm. But the lion didn't attack, didn't snarl, didn't even take a step closer. It lowered its head. Rain matted its mane. Lightning illuminated the deep scars across its chest, and in its eyes, something ancient and devastating shone through. Recognition, understanding, grief. The cub in the ranger's arms let out a tiny, quivering sound. The lion stepped forward, slowly, carefully, and touched its nose to the cub's head. A rumble vibrated in its chest, low and mournful. The ranger felt it through the ground. This was the cub's father, and he had come back for his family. The cub's tiny paw lifted weakly, brushing against the lion's massive foreleg. The father lion bent closer and released a sound the ranger had never heard before. Not a roar, not a growl. Something softer, something that vibrated like heartbreak. The cub's breathing slowed. The ranger felt the moment it happened. The cub exhaled, its body relaxed, its paw slid gently to the ground, and it went still. "No," the ranger whispered, voice cracking. "God, no." He held the cub tightly against his chest, shaking, rain mixing with tears he didn't realize he still had in him. The father lion lifted his head to the sky and roared, a sound of grief so raw it cleaved the storm in half. Lightning split the clouds. Thunder answered. The plains trembled. The ranger bowed his head. This wasn't the miracle he expected. Not the return he hoped for, not the redemption he wanted, but it was the truth the land had been whispering all along. Sometimes miracles hurt more than tragedies, and sometimes the wild doesn't save you. Sometimes the wild shows you the cost of love. The storm eased into a trembling drizzle as dawn crept across the plains, brushing the world in muted silver. The ranger sat in the mud, holding the cub's small, lifeless body against his chest. The weight was almost nothing, too light for the burden it carried. He had held many dying creatures in his lifetime, but this one carved deeper than all the rest, cutting through every scar he thought had hardened long ago. The father lion stood only a few steps away, his massive frame outlined against the pale horizon. He didn't move, didn't roar, didn't blink. He simply watched, eyes ancient, burning, grieving. Rain clung to his mane like threads of glass. The ranger swallowed hard, his voice raw. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the cub, though the words were meant for the lion too. "I tried. God, I tried." For a long time, nothing happened. The plains stayed quiet. Even the wind held its breath. Then, slowly, the lion stepped forward. The ranger tensed, not out of fear, but out of respect. He bowed his head, offering the cub's body with shaking hands. The lion lowered himself to the ground. lowering his enormous head until his nose touched the cub's forehead. A rumble echoed from deep within his chest, low, aching, almost like a final lullaby. The ranger could barely breathe. The lion nudged the cub gently, once, twice, as if urging it to wake, urging it to stand, urging it to live. But the small body remained still. The truth settled in the air like morning frost. The father lion lifted his head again, eyes glistening with something the ranger never believed he would witness in a creature so fierce and wild. Love. Loss. Goodbye. The ranger wiped his face, inhaled shakily, then stood with effort, still clutching the two newborn cubs tucked inside his shirt. Their faint warmth against his chest reminded him that not all hope had died beneath the storm. He looked at the lion. "I'll take care of them. Your little ones. I'll keep them safe. I swear it." For a moment, he thought the lion didn't understand. But then the great beast stepped back, not aggressively, but deliberately, creating a path for the ranger to leave. A gesture of trust, of surrender, of acknowledgement. The ranger hesitated, glancing down at the tiny cub he had failed to save. His throat tightened. He gently placed its body near the sheltered overhang, beside the spot where the lioness had taken her last breaths. A family reunited in death. He whispered, "Rest now," and stepped away. When he finally turned to walk toward the rising sun, the newborn cubs pressed weakly against his heartbeat, searching for warmth. The ranger tightened his grip. Behind him, the father lion released a final, haunting roar that echoed across the plains like a farewell carved into the very bones of the earth. The ranger didn't look back. He knew if he did, he might never leave. By the time he reached the outpost, the sun had fully risen, casting long beams across the savannah. The ranger stumbled inside, body trembling, vision swimming from exhaustion. He laid the two newborn cubs onto a padded crate lined with blankets and immediately began warming milk, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the bottle. They were so small, so fragile. Their fur barely covered their skin. Their breaths were faint and quick, like shadows flickering in and out of the world. But they were alive, and that meant something. He fed them drop by cautious drop. At first they were too weak to swallow, but after a few minutes, one latched onto the bottle with surprising determination. Then the other. The ranger exhaled a ragged breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You're fighters," he whispered. "Just like your brother." The memory of the dying cub gripped him like a fist. He paused, setting the bottle aside, letting grief wash over him in heavy, silent waves. For years he had locked his emotions away, buried them beneath routine, solitude, duty. But holding these tiny lives brought everything back. Loss, love, responsibility. The same things he had once failed to protect. But not this time. Not again. He worked through the day, cleaning, tending, checking for dehydration, keeping them warm. As the sun dipped low, turning the sky into a river of orange, he stepped outside to breathe the evening air. The plains stretched endlessly before him, quiet, vast, beautiful in a way that hurt. He looked toward the distant cliffs where the lion's den lay hidden among stone and brush. Though miles away, he swore he could still feel the presence of the father lion, watching, waiting, trusting him with what remained of his bloodline. The ranger placed a hand over his chest, feeling the small movements of the cubs nestled close inside his jacket. For years, He had lived with the weight of not being able to save the people he loved. But today, in the middle of chaos, violence, and loss, one creature had trusted him enough to lead him into the dark. A creature that had used its last breath not for itself, but for others. It had shown him courage. It had shown him purpose. It had shown him how to live again. As the first stars appeared overhead, the ranger whispered into the dusk, "Thank you, little one." A soft breeze brushed his face, warm, gentle, almost like an answer. Months passed, and the world slowly softened around the ranger in ways he didn't expect. The two newborn cubs, once fragile bundles of trembling breath, grew stronger with each sunrise. Their legs steadied, their eyes opened, bright and curious. Their tiny roars, at first nothing more than squeaks, eventually became bold, defiant cries that filled the outpost with life. The ranger spent his days tending to them, feeding them, teaching them, watching them stumble through their first attempts at play. And in those small, clumsy moments, something inside him healed in ways he hadn't realized were still broken. He built an enclosure near the outpost, secure enough to protect them, but wide enough for them to run. They chased each other through tall grass, pounced clumsily on leaves, and napped in sunbeams with their heads resting on his boots. Every little sound they made reminded him of the cub who had led him through the storm, the small heartbeat that had changed the course of his life. He carried that memory like a quiet fire, steady and warm, something he revisited whenever loneliness threatened to return. Sometimes, late at night, he would climb the ridge overlooking the savannah. The plains stretched endlessly before him, turning silver under the moon in the distance beyond the dry riverbed and the broken cliffs. He often saw a shadow moving, a silhouette large and unmistakable. A lion, the father lion, watching, guarding, grieving, perhaps, but never coming closer. The ranger didn't call out, didn't wave, didn't try to approach. Some distances weren't meant to be closed. Some relationships survived in silence, built on shared loss and a fragile thread of trust. And in those quiet nights, the ranger felt something he hadn't felt in years. He didn't feel alone. News of the poachers eventually reached the conservation team. The men were arrested after abandoning their wounded comrade in a nearby township, his arm torn by a lion, his story frantic and incoherent. Rangers swept the area, shutting down camps, burning snares, and collecting evidence from the gorge. But none of it mattered to the man at the outpost as much as the two cubs sleeping safely at his feet. He named them Hope and Horizon, because one reminded him to keep moving, and the other reminded him that the world was still wide and full of promise. One evening, nearly a year after the storm, he hiked with the cubs, now nearly grown, to the edge of a low plateau overlooking the plains. The breeze rolled through the grass. Birds circled overhead, and the world felt quiet in a way that only truth can make it quiet. He knelt beside the lions, running a hand through their manes. "You're ready," he whispered. They didn't understand the words, but they sensed the moment. The weight, the goodbye woven into the wind. The ranger stepped back, giving them space. Hope looked at him once, head tilted, eyes bright with confusion and loyalty. Horizon nudged his leg gently, as if asking for one last reassurance. He smiled through the ache in his chest, placing a hand on each of their heads. "Go," he said softly. "The world is yours now. Live boldly. Live freely. Live for the one who couldn't." For a long heartbeat, they hesitated. Then, with a powerful leap, They bounded across the plateau and disappeared into the tall grass. Two golden streaks slicing through the earth, wild and unstoppable. The ranger stood alone on the ridge as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky ignited in gold and crimson, flooding the plains with a warmth that felt almost like an embrace. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, letting the moment wash over him. He had lost much. He had suffered much. But he had gained something too. Something profound enough to redefine the very shape of his life. He glanced toward the cliff where a distant roar echoed in reply. Deep, thunderous, familiar. The father lion. The ranger smiled. Some creatures enter our lives quietly. Some tear through like storms. And some, no matter how small, teach us courage big enough to change everything. As darkness settled, he whispered into the wind, not knowing if anyone or anything would hear. "Thank you for leading me home." And the savannah answered with silence, warm and alive, holding his words gently in its vast and ancient heart. Sometimes, the smallest heartbeat teaches you what it truly means to be human.